Why we die. I'm alive because sex feels good. Otherwise, my parents never would have thought of it. I die because if I didn't, and no one else did either, the earth would soon become so congested and living conditions so intolerable that people would try to kill each other day in and day out, but all in vain, since no one could die. Therefore, as far as I can tell, I'm born in order to feel good, and I die in order to make room for others, who like me die in order to make room for still more others, until the earth is exhausted and becomes a second moon. So, the dead had no choice but to die on my behalf, and I have no choice but to die on behalf of the not yet born, who are perfect strangers to me. I should feel resentment at the not yet born, because if it weren't for them, I wouldn't have to die, or at least could postpone it for a long time. But my resentment is balanced by my satisfaction that at least the dead had to die for me. So that's what Jesus dying for our sins is all about. A last-ditch effort at interpreting rationally the adamantly absurd fact that because we're born, we die. To sum up, nature blesses our birth, wishing us nothing but joy and happiness, but at the same time curses us under her breath, assured that we will eventually sicken and die. If nature were a human mother, she'd be diagnosed as schizophrenic, institutionalized, and we, her children, would become wards of the state. Would that someday we become wards of a state of our own making, instead of one imposed on us by nature's henchmen. How do we cope with having an apparently ageless mom, our dad is out of the picture, who nurtures us with loving care when we're young, then years later, for no apparent reason, grows furious with us and kills us in our sleep? Is the notion of nature as a murderous mom an archetype? I think of Euripides' Bacchae, where Pentheus's homicidal mother, Agave, shakes her son out of a tree and tears him to pieces, and wonder if, in the beginning, there wasn't a perfectly straightforward philosophy of nature which told it like it is, but which, bowdlerized into myth over millennia, currently has assumed the form of a high-tech wives' tale, sanctified by science in favor of natural order. "Look at it this way, madam," God must have explained to my mom, denying her request. "If offspring live forever, the teeming earth would soon be so oppressive that everyone would perish. To avoid this catastrophe, take my advice. At the moment of conception, a time every bit as hectic for your son as for his parents, while he is distracted by the novelty of beginning to be, mark him for death, but do it stealthily, as if you were planting an illegal substance on him years before he's scheduled to be searched and seized. Later, when he is old and full of years, he'll thank you for it. He, on his part, will blithely procreate, thereby paying his ecological dues by transmitting death to future generations, while at the same time ensuring that a part of you, the part embodied in your descendants, will always live." Seeing no way around my eventual death, and thanking God for consigning to instinct, in this case sexual, those decisions which are impossible for us to make without being torn apart, Mom swore that if death by prearrangement was the only way that I might live, then prearrange she must, even if her baby came to dust. When I began my speculation on why we die, my first thought was that if everyone who would ever or had ever lived had lived at the same time, then, owing to the exhaustion of the limited food sources as the result of the insupportable number of people, the species would have perished in the course of a single generation. The idea made me appreciate the importance to our survival as a species of the sequentiality of the generations, to stretching them out over time rather than bunching them together. But my second thought brought me up short. If owing to the limited land area available for cultivation, combined with the necessarily slow and measured seasonal process required in order to renew our food supply, one generation must perish for its successor to thrive, then, in a surprising way, for what are people whom I'll never know to me, we die for each other. According to the Bible, we die because we're bad. But according to an account more in keeping with evolutionary theory, we die not because we're bad, but because we're poor. We live in tight quarters. There is not enough space on the planet for any single species to propagate itself without limit. Therefore, in order to accommodate as many species as possible without exhausting food resources, nature has adjusted the average lifespan of individuals so as not to overload an always precarious food supply. Let me illustrate what I mean. Suppose we humans lived on the average as long as Methuselah, who is alleged to have died just short of her 970th birthday. Suppose further that Methuselah women were capable of bearing children between the ages of 194 and 485, approximately the same ratio as 14 years old to 50 years old in a 70-year lifespan. If the term of pregnancy of the Methuselah mother lasted as at present for 9 months, and if the mother bore one child a year during her period of fertility, then in the course of her childbearing years she would be capable of producing 291 children. Again, if each of her 291 children reached puberty at the age of 194 and began to propagate their kind on a yearly basis, then, supposing half the number of her children were male and half female, and they all mated with partners chosen outside the family, then, in the course of 291 years, Grandma and Grandpa would dandle on their knees 291 times 291, or 84,681 grandchildren. If this number represents the average family size of the same number of families as exists at present throughout the world, food sources required to feed everyone, supposing the resources equal to those at the present time, would be exhausted in a single generation, and the human species would perish. Scientific research on yeast and worms has established that longevity genes do exist, which control the organism's lifespan. It's possible, then, that humans likewise possess longevity genes, such that over immense periods of time the genes regulate the average lifespan of the members of a species, increasing the lifespan according to the success in finding nourishment enjoyed by members of a species whose numbers are continually increasing, but decreasing the lifespan according to the failure of ever-increasing numbers to secure enough nourishment to sustain life. In other words, when the rate of increase slows because available food resources are unable to satisfy the growing numbers, adaptation favors those variations of a species whose lifespans are shorter. They are favored because their generations pass more quickly, and thus the demand for food is more in accord with the food-producing cycle of the seasons. To reiterate, over immense periods of time, longevity genes adapt, by means of the individuals whose genes they are, to the amount of nourishment available to a species, with the result that the average lifespan of the members of a species increases or decreases according to the availability of those food resources. For example, if the present population on Earth were transplanted to a planet the size of Jupiter, which is approximately 11 times the size of Earth, with 11 times the food resources available than at present on Earth, then, over millennia, human longevity would tend to increase 11 times until the number of mouths to feed taxed the ability of the planet to fill them. Conversely, if the number of people on Earth decreased 11-fold, while food resources continued the same as at present, then again our longevity would tend to increase until our numbers began to outrun the resources. If the Earth had proved to be of infinite extent, as our primordial ancestors hoped it was when they speculated that the Earth was flat, so that we never exhausted the food resources no matter how rapidly we increased in number, then, of course, we would have lived indefinitely, although not necessarily in a form recognizable as ourselves. Since, however, the Earth is not infinite, living indefinitely is not an option. Nevertheless, dying, say, at the age of 200 is not something to sneer at. But how to reduce the global population drastically and keep it at that low number the length of time necessary for genetic selection to take effect appeared to me an insurmountable obstacle in the way of increasing our longevity. Unless, of course, geneticists were able to manipulate human longevity genes so as to collapse the aeons of adaptation into a single lifetime. The result, however, as I have explained above, would be disastrous, as slowly aging multiple generations with much longer periods of fertility would begin to overlap and crowd each other out. Universal famine would ensue, a result that could only end with parents and children engaging in deadly competition for whatever food that remained. Then I thought of Sophocles' drama, Oedipus the King. The play is about a king who is forewarned that his wife is destined to give birth to a son who will kill him. Therefore the king, who rules Thebes, refrains from having children until years later, coming home drunk from a party, he conceives a child with his wife. When she gives birth to a son, fearing the oracle, the king orders that the infant be abandoned on a mountain and left to die. Unbeknownst to the king, however, the infant is rescued and brought up by the childless queen of the neighboring kingdom of Corinth. Years later, on a road too narrow for two chariots to pass at the same time, Oedipus slays the king as the result of a quarrel, an ancient example of road rage, about who should pass first. When Oedipus arrives in Thebes, he frees the city from the domination of the Sphinx by solving the following riddle. What animal is that which goes on 4 feet in the morning, on 2 at noon, and on 3 in the evening? Oedipus answers correctly, man, who, when he is an infant, creeps on all 4s, when he has attained manhood, goes on 2 feet, and when old, uses a staff, a 3rd foot. Oedipus subsequently wins the throne and marries the queen, who in fact is his mother. He has 4 children by her. After some years, the crops become blighted, and Thebes is afflicted with famine and pestilence. The oracle declares that the misfortune is owing to the fact that the killer of the former king is still at large. Suspecting treachery against the state, Oedipus conducts an investigation. When he discovers that he himself is guilty of killing his father and marrying his mother, he blinds himself in an act of self-punishment. Sigmund Freud, who was impressed by a parricide marrying his widowed mother, thought that the Oedipus myth, upon which the drama is based, represents the archetypal power struggle between father and son over the woman to whom they are both connected, one by marriage, the other by birth. Sir James Frazer, on the other hand, focusing on the famine in Thebes and the desperate need on the part of the citizens to upgrade the luck of the city, interpreted the slaying of the old king by the new one as an example of a ritual connected with prehistoric fortune worship. Both Freud and Frazer would have regarded the early period in which the Oedipus myth surfaced as a time which marked the naive and inchoate beginnings of scientific thought. But I take a different view of the matter. When I consider the immense period of time which precedes recorded history, a stretch of time containing hundreds of thousands of years filled with the ups and downs of human development, I see no reason to doubt, just because there is no record of it, that the narrative form which the Oedipus myth has assumed represents a late decadent version of the idea, which would have been transmitted orally over many generations until it was suppressed, that the existence of the human species depends on the necessity that one generation die, that another generation may live. Now, the reason this idea, embedded in the dramatic narrative of Sophocles' play, probably without the playwright's awareness, was suppressed is because it contradicts the code of behavior universal throughout the ancient world, namely, that one should love one's friends and hate one's enemies. The contradiction follows from the fact that if someone's survival depends on your death, then that person is your enemy. But if, owing to the precariousness of food resources, the survival of your progeny requires the death of you, their progenitor, then, if your children are to survive, repress the notion as much as they may, your children and the members of their generation must secretly wish you and the members of your generation dead. Hence, your children are to be classed among your enemies, and you among theirs. At the same time, however, the natural bond between parent and child forms the essence of social coherence, without which all social endeavor is rendered futile. As in modern times, so anciently, the contradiction is too glaring to be tolerated, but too true to be entirely suppressed. And so the theory that we die for each other was buried in a remarkable story about a king named Oedipus. The agents in the prehistorical scientific model, upon which we presume the Oedipus material is based, and which the myth was intended to suppress, were not individuals as in the drama, but were generations, namely, the successive generations which rival each other for limited food supplies. I didn't get it at first, but after the umpteenth time of reading the riddle, I realized that just as in the riddle the life of a human is condensed into the morning, noon, and evening of a single day, so in the drama the generation is compacted into a single individual character. Accordingly, Oedipus's father, King Laius, represents the older generation. Oedipus, at the time of the slaying of the king years earlier, the younger generation. But at the beginning of Sophocles' play, the aged Oedipus represents the current older generation, while the crowd of mute and starving Theban children, whose spokesman is the old priest, represents the current younger generation. I am suggesting, then, that by layering over the original scientific theory with a dramatic action in which a son unknowingly kills his father, the original theory, which exposed the natural but cruel necessity that the survival of a younger generation requires the casual extermination of an older generation, the theory was deformed into literature. The original theory, then, that informs the Oedipus myth is a prehistorical predecessor of the first principle of natural selection, that all organisms tend to have more offspring than can survive in the local environment. Retranslating the myth as dramatized by Sophocles back into the original theory, we see that an oracle predicts that the generation of sons will cause the death of the generation of their fathers. The fathers remain sexually continent in order to prevent the birth of progeny, but to no avail. When the younger generation is born, the fathers abandon it and leave it to die. Owing to pity for the abandoned generation on the part of those who do not share the father's overriding will to live, the younger generation is saved and brought up elsewhere. The inevitability with which one generation succeeds another is conveyed by the ineluctable fate which the older generation suffers when, upon encountering the younger on the road, it challenges it to a fight. The road is too narrow for two chariots to pass at the same time, that is, the food resources too scant for multi-generations to prosper at the same time. One must yield to the other. The answer to the riddle of the Sphinx, which Oedipus solves, itself hints at another riddle, which is relevant to our own times. The baby who crawls on all fours and the mature man who stands on 2 feet are both products of nature, but the walking stick which the old man utilizes represents the artificial limb of technology. In order to prosper in later phases of development, the human generations must reach beyond the models presented by nature. New techniques in agroscience, for instance, which increase the yield 100-fold. Moreover, with the rise of modern genetics, handmade man, man-made man, invents a technology designed to remake himself in his own image, that is, in whatever image he decides suits him best. The question, what that image might be, is in fact already under discussion and will in the future become a major theme of political debate. The blighted crops and ensuing famine depicted in the Oedipus drama are then the least distorted components of the original theory. Ancient food production was technically primitive and crop yields were meager. Population continually outran nutrition, an ecological unbalance that necessitated periodic emigrations and incursions into the territory of foreign nations. In other words, required making war in order to survive. Anyone conversant with ancient history knows that history begins with hunger and unfolds according to the course one takes to satisfy the hunger. The politically radical message implied in the Oedipus myth lies in the killing of the fathers. What simpler way to 9/11 the patriarchy than to kill the fathers? That is, to break the economic stranglehold the older generation exerts on the younger by throwing the older to the ground. Killing one's father means here toppling the hierarchy by putting it under a new filial, that is, egalitarian, management. That Oedipus is filled with remorse and blinds himself marks the intervention of patriarchic censorship, which relegates the egalitarian alternative as taboo. Finally, begetting offspring with one's mother throws kinship and hence the social institutions based on kinship, like inheritance, into confusion. If I marry my mother, I am at one and the same time husband and son to her, at one and the same time father and brother to our children. Incest shatters the conventional family. It represents an ultimate leveling of society which makes the Russian Revolution carried out by the Bolsheviks seem like the work of dilettantes. The taboo against incest and the horror of parricide constitute the nuclear family's atomic stockpile. its last defense against attack by those who, even unconsciously like Oedipus, would tamper with family structure in order to make it more amenable to radical egalitarian society. If it's true, as I contend, that given the always limited, however much bolstered by technology, global food supply, the current generations must die in order that future generations may live, the question arises how we all ought to feel about the situation, about having our pursuit of happiness terminated so that others, whom we'll never know, may enjoy a like pursuit of happiness, which will likewise be terminated, and on, generation after generation, until the last generation steps into the void and pulls it in after it. If pursuit of happiness structures life, then death represents the interruption of that pursuit, so that others may enjoy a like pursuit of happiness. So long as the others are close family or loved ones, we feel too ashamed not to put a good face on or to tragically mask our resentment at having our happiness interrupted. But everyone resents having his or her happiness cut short on behalf of perfect strangers. Therefore, if living is a source of happiness, but everyone without exception must sacrifice that happiness, ultimately on behalf of perfect strangers, then, seeing that we're all equally victimized by nature because everyone dies, the humane corrective to this indiscriminate sacrifice demanded by nature lies in making sure that no one is sacrificed, that is, victimized, more than another. This egalitarian imperative is carried out by developing and distributing resources in the name of all of us, rather than by leaving their development and distribution to chance, that is, to whoever gets there first. Thus, in the public domain, the egalitarian elevates the ideal of fairness over that of good fortune. The meritocrat, on the other hand, who models his ethics on the inscrutable impartiality of enjoying good fortune or having bad luck, designs society so that the burden of suffering is shifted from the winners in the race for life's rewards to the losers. In contrast to the egalitarian, the meritocrat regrets but finally condones the division of society into the happy and hapless, the more capable and the less capable, thereby construing the impartial, if also inequitable, distribution of the gifts of fortune as natural law. Accordingly, the meritocrat refines raw fortune into merit. That is, that I deserve to be rewarded for the good things that happen to me because they happen to me and not to you, and thereby produces a spurious and vicious humanization of nature. Spurious because the argument is circular. I deserve to be rewarded because I am rewarded. Vicious because the pursuit of happiness of some requires the wretchedness of others. And why must this be the case? Because what's irresistible about enjoying good fortune over others is not the happiness per se of winning, but the opportunity granted to winners to control the fortunes of losers, with the result that losers must depend on winners, as winners depend on the gods. In short, it's godlike to control someone's luck, and feeling like a god is a very good feeling, probably the best. Furthermore, the more people whose luck you control, the more like a god you feel. Finally, feeling like a god is some compensation for having to die like a rat. Just so would the meritocrat argue if he understood his motivation. That is, if I can't have my way and live forever, I'll feel somewhat compensated for my mortality if I can bring it about that I sacrifice others as nature has sacrificed me. And since I cannot lay my hands on the not yet born, at least not directly, who after all are responsible for my death, I'll take vengeance by proxy on those who are closest, namely on my contemporaries, whom I have bested in the race for life's prizes, by openly, methodically, and even with their agreement, making their lives miserable. Enough clashing of classes. Let us return to what's true for all of us. Every loving mother advises her children, live with gusto as if you didn't die, but look both ways before you cross the street. It's a mixed message, what psychologists call a double bind. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. How must we arrange life so that we're blessed if we do, blessed if we don't? I don't know, but I look at it this way. When nature learned that there wasn't enough to go around, she compromised. She agreed that all must die, so long as some at one time, others at another, survive until the bowl is empty. Consequently, there's not a single creature who doesn't have a beef with nature. Let's face it, friends, apparently we have to die for each other whether we like it or not, which can't be love because it's involuntary. What is voluntary, however, is our willingness to remodel the world in which this travesty takes place. The world is not our natural home. It's our refuge from nature, just as the bird's nest is not grown by the tree, but is consciously designed to suit the bird. We need to remodel the world until every creature, since we have to die for each other anyway, is, even if just barely, worth dying for. Finally, I ended my meditation by writing an ode to nature, in which I express my disenchantment with the idea of having to die. Ode to Nature. Sure, the molten earth spun off from the molten sun, but was it a good idea? When Mom cooled down, she planted a garden and opened a zoo, because, so she intimated, that was what she was meant to do. Sure, Mom, when you were no more than a glint in the sun's eye, you saw yourself hoeing and milking. Gardening and husbandry, those were her strengths. Furthermore, she excelled in conceiving things no one had thought of before, like trees and bees and knees, all original with her. Be fruitful and multiply was her advice, but lest we take her at her word and multiply beyond our means and eat ourselves out of house and home, she'd taken the precaution of installing in each of us a kill switch that tripped automatically whenever we asked for a second helping. Postscript. Species politics. In view of our differences from each other, as well as our differences with each other, that we're all members of the same human species remains hypothetical and unconvincing, until we realize that, owing to the limited space on the planet for the production of nourishing food, one generation of us must die in order to make room for another. Or, to put it bluntly, we die for each other whether we like it or not. Since the parties to this ongoing biological arrangement, and here the Bible and Darwin are in agreement, are generations, it seems appropriate that the primary agent of planetary politics ought to be the generation, not the nation. The nations, in fact, by breaking the generation into pieces, have proved themselves counterproductive with regard to the formation of a more wholesome global politics. This is likewise true of the world religions, although the broken pieces are larger. Finally, the family, without which the generation is impossible, continues at present to be of paramount economic importance to its members, but currently, in the national scheme of things, it has no political legitimacy. With the rise of the generation, however, the political participation of the family will rise with it. This is so because the family unites the three living generations of the young, the mature, and the elderly, and therefore is the indispensable nodal point that binds us together. Once the family is integrated into the generation, child, parent, and grandparent will at last be members of a single species. In order to get the ball rolling toward establishing the sovereignty of the generation, I suggest that we count off the generations at 20-year intervals, starting with the year 2013. Let's consider the composition of the first generation. Whoever will have turned 13 years of age in the course of the year 2013 will at midnight on December 31st, 2013, automatically be counted among the members of the first official worldwide generation. In other words, at the same time as we celebrate the new year, rather than flushing the old year down the drain as usual, we will recycle it by celebrating it as the birthday of what we will name the young generation. When the members of the young generation turn 33 in the year 2033, at the end of that year, we will celebrate it as the birthday of the worldwide mature generation. Finally, when the members of the first mature generation turn 66 in the year 2066, we will celebrate that year as the birthday of the worldwide older generation. The aim of each of the three generations will be to exert pressure on national establishments to improve living conditions on a global scale for the members of the three age groups, each generation focusing on its own worldwide membership. National establishments, of course, will stiffly resist losing control over their populations. But if the worldwide generations prevail and achieve institutional status, then hopefully by the 22nd century, the nations will be reduced to serving as convenient administrative subdivisions of the generations, and politics, for the first time in human history, will be conducted by the people who inhabit the planet on a global rather than national basis.